This is the European History Lecture for Tuesday, the 26th of April, 2022. The Japanese national essence, or kokutai, is essentially a form of Shinto totalitarianism. It is not imposed by the modern industrial world. It comes from their own pre-industrial culture, which makes them the people of the God Emperor, and the willingness to live without a devoted life to the Emperor, without any restraint, without holding back, without limit, is what defines this, making the Japanese people willing to alter some pretty fundamental things about the way they look at the world and about what they're willing to do with their lives for the sake because they are, in fact, not an end, but rather a means to an end. The end is the Emperor. They are the means. And so, with even more total devotion than a true believing Confucian. Pass that back, please. The Japanese people are willing to adapt and change. And this gives the nation a nimbleness in the face of history that allows them to do, for example, what China was unwilling to do in the 19th century, which is acknowledge the reality of the modern world. The Chinese lived in Egypt, the land of denial, looking down on the round-eyed barbarians. And in doing so, opened themselves up to conquest. And the only reason China wasn't conquered is because the United States insisted on the open door policy, which gave all European and Japan, all European nations and Japan, the ability to mutually exploit China. If that hadn't happened, China would certainly have been carved up into European colonies for at least a while. Japan never had to do this because Japan changed. And if you've ever tried to change a habit of yours, you understand that one of the most difficult things in life is to change your ways, to change your habit, to change what you expect out of daily life. But for the God Emperor, they will do it. In a culture that prizes conformity, they will do it. And in a culture that tends to raise children in such a manner that makes them much more flexible and pliable adults, at least in terms of matching themselves to the culture, they do it. On the one hand, the Japanese are remarkably flexible to adapting to the demands of their culture. On the other hand, they are remarkably stubborn and will not accept reasonable situations if they contravene their kokutai, their national essence. Now, in the military, there's another lovely Japanese word I'm going to give you, and that's Gekko. Gekko, which I'm certainly pronouncing wrong, is a weird phenomenon of patron-client relationships. If you recall patron-client relationships from the old Roman Republic, the patron is an old fellow with political influence, money, power. The client is a young fellow who is starting out in life and needs the guidance and the support of a wealthy older fellow. And in return for that guidance and support, the client is willing to give service, loyalty. It's a feudal thing. It's not a modern contract with amount of money or quid pro. No, it's a feudal thing. I, your patron, will be loyal to you, and I will help you become a great person. You, the client, will be loyal to me, and you will serve my house. as a knight would serve a lord. And someday you'll be a patron. However, in Japanese organizations and society, there is an odd wrinkle to this that is not so much there in the European patron-client system. The client, aside from getting guidance and tacit support, has the right to ask of the patron, in return for his devotion to the death, which is the way the Japanese roll. They don't just give a little loyalty. This is samurai stuff. Samurai do not fail. Samurai do or die, literally. So in return for that, the patron owes the client, the old powerful man owes the young up-and-coming man, an unspecified favor. One unspecified favor, a service. And usually the young men do not squander that, because that is one of the most precious things they can possibly have. Unspecified favor from somebody more powerful than them, that could be almost anything. And this system where the lesser have the ability to compel the greater, where the tail has the ability to wag the dog, is going to bring Japan into China, into war, and into ultimately world war. And you will see this, Gekko Kujo, at play when we talk about the Japanese in Manchuria in 1931. The Japanese are going to engage in imperialism because that's what powerful countries do, and it's like a poison animal that shows bright colors. Whenever you see an animal with bright colors, stay away because it's probably poisonous. Not always, but usually. For example, stonefish look like rocks. That's why they call it stonefish. And they're among the most poisonous creatures on Earth. Don't go swimming in Australia and step on a rock. Yeah, try to do that. Because the rock might be a stonefish and you might just die.
Can we see a picture?
It looks like a rock.
Yeah.
You can imagine it. You can look it up on your own anyway, just like that, and just like if you're on a New York subway, you both don't make eye contact but don't look away. You act like somebody who's ready at any moment for violence. And in acting ready for violence, you deter violence. Weakness always invites attack. Always. Remember that when you think about politics, the military, foreign affairs, and things like that. The leaders of countries are not nice lawyer people except in the West. They're the most aggressive folk in their land. If you act like prey around certain leaders, they'll go for you. So don't act like prey. So the Japanese are going to engage in imperialism in China, in Korea, and elsewhere, because that's what powerful countries do, and engaging in imperialism will deter attack against their God Emperor and against their nation. I've already told you about the devotion that that a soldier is expected to have, about the brutalization of soldiers in basic training and throughout their experience in the military. It's not uncommon for a superior officer to physically beat or smack their inferiors. It's done less often these days, but it's still not unheard of. Whereas in the American military, that is considered, I don't know. A soldier is considered dead when he enters the service, and he only becomes back to life, is resurrected when he retires alive from the service. He gives his life to the emperor, and the emperor gives his life back if he lives. What I didn't tell you is that civilians are basically not very different. In America, you are taught that you are ends unto yourself. What that means is that you matter intrinsically. that you have value and worth because you're a human being. You have inalienable human rights. You have priceless value because you have a soul. You are, therefore, not expected to engage in gratuitous self-destruction. You are not expected to take your own life or to do something that is suicide. You may choose to. That's different. So in the military, there are often assignments that they give you where they ask for volunteers. And that's a sign right there that it's probably a suicide mission. Because normally they'll just tell you. But asking for volunteers, you're asking for people who are committed to the mission above surviving. In Japan, everyone, at any moment, might find it necessary, because of honor, to save face, to do something that will bring destruction. Yes? I waited until you were just beginning your yawn.
Have you seen the show Chicago PD?
No.
Okay, so it's basically about like this cop guy, but he was he used to be a criminal, but in order to get him out of jail because he knew so much about like all this like underground stuff,
Yep.
They ended up making him like a sergeant in the police force, and so he he was in control of like this entire unit, and so he called shots, and so whenever like he would go and smack somebody around a little bit to get some answers, which you're to technically do.
Yeah.
He would always say like, tell him it was a domestic, and like just like lie about things.
Well,
so that he could get the information he needed to save people.
There is a degree of old-fashioned police work that is not about the rules, it's not about the rights of the accused. It's about protecting people. And trust me, I miss old-style policing. I really do. Not that I think it was particularly brutal, but it knew when to be brutal. And there are times when you've got to be for the sake of the mission.
I was just kind of thinking what you're talking about, like why in America, like officer slapped a junior, it's a big no-no as opposed to like somewhere in Asia even now. It's just because, like I guess I'll just lump them all into the Eastern kind of Eastern militaries. Officers are viewed as beings on just like a bit of like a different level than your junior enlisted or just enlisted who are essentially lower life forms.
Yeah.
Because officers are like your aristocracy, or they're your big.
Yeah, it's feudalism, but more than that. You're right.
Yeah,
it goes beyond
you
social
come
class.
over here, and then really anybody puts in the work to be an officer, whether they're a good officer or not.
Yeah. The environmentalist officers. Look, I will say that one of the great things about the United States and about the West in general is we are much more open to the idea of meritocracy. In North Korea, it's a communist utopia where absolutely your social class determines everything.
But yeah, it's hard to find, like, at least in the junior officer level, it's hard to find a bad officer who just is an absolute idiot. You find some ones that they're all right. You have your good ones, but it's really hard to find a bad one. It kind of gets worse as you go up.
Yeah. So, how does the society police itself? Well, George Orwell did not invent the thought police. They're called the Toko, or the Shiso Kai Satsu, or the Tokubetsu Koto Kai Satsu. Literally, they are the thought police. The thought police are there to make sure that in thought, word, and deed, the people are doing what they should do. So, to monitor the civil population, you have people who are prepared to arrest and re-educate you because of attitudes. Now, this is quintessentially totalitarian. It's as if the people who used to run Twitter, until yesterday, had control over the police, the courts, and the prisons. Because, trust me, being in Twitter jail and being in real jail are different things.
Are you sure?
Yes. Twitter jail usually doesn't involve forced homosexuality. Real jail all too often does, at least in the United States. It's one of the worst things about our prison system. So, it's not what you do that is criminal, that will get you in trouble. It's what you do that runs counter to the narrative. And in Japan, the narrative is increasingly written by the army, with the emperor as a backstop, the navy going along, and the civil government basically like a battered spouse going along because they need to. And when I say battered spouse, I mean the army starts assassinating politicians that stand up to them, and they get away with it. And the last dozen years or so before World War II begins in 1941 is a tale of a variety of Japanese civil politicians trying to get control of the government like they're supposed to have. We're talking prime ministers, ministers of war, and so forth. And again and again and again, these courageous fellows end up falling on some bullets, or flying out of their window in a tall building, or being stabbed by a knife dozens and dozens of times, or being blown up, just because explosions happen spontaneously. And nobody gets punished. Everyone knows who does it. Sorry, I've got to make a Putin reference here. The only country on Earth that kills people with radiation poisoning by injecting radioactive isotopes into their food or into them is the Russian Federation. And for the last 20 or 30, 20 years, people have died all around the world of intense radiation poisoning. And it's not like they were visiting nuclear power plants or nuclear submarines. Nobody can prove it was Putin, but everyone knows it was Putin. Which is what you want when you're assassinating people. The Japanese army was definitely blamed, but no crimes were ever proven. So people were afraid of the Japanese army, and it took, and even so, and this is to the Japanese credit, there were still politicians who stood up to them, and who risked being assassinated, and many were. This is going to set the stage for World War II in the Pacific. Any questions about Japan before we move into springtime for Hitler and Germany? Winter for Poland and France. I could just keep singing until I get a question.
Please do.
That would be wrong.
No, it sounds great. I don't know what you're talking about.
So, okay.
It's good.
We're going to Deutschland. And we're going to talk about the rise of National Socialism. First off, a reminder. The Germans, after World War I and in the interwar period, are angry. They are very angry indeed. They have grievances. The German army was stabbed in the back by the Jews and the Socialists. The people who ended up taking over after the Kaiser abdicated personally benefited from the power that they got by losing the war. This theory ignores the Black Day of the German army, it ignores reality, but it's the same thing as the theory that says that America didn't lose Vietnam, we just gave up. Well, giving up is losing. I'm sorry, if your people decide that the war is not worth fighting, that's an L. And as much as I had wanted or would have wanted us to win in Vietnam, the war was fought so badly. It's easy for me to say, but it was. So it's a myth. No, we lost in Vietnam because our will to fight was eroded. That is one way you can win or lose a war. So the Germans, who were nationalists, believed they didn't actually lose the war. They were stabbed in the back by Jews and socialists and traitors. They were furious at having to accept war guilt because they're Germans. Okay, this is the most compulsive people in Europe. Everything you must write between the lines. You must not exceed the circle when you are filling in a multiple choice bubble. Everything has to be inordinate. And to take a legalistic people like that and force them to admit guilt for a war that was not really their fault is outrageous, and they are outraged by it. Their economy is blighted by ridiculous indemnities because the British and others promised to make the Germans pay for the war if the British won, and the British won, so the Germans are going to pay for the war. And this is going to lead to repeated, ongoing economic collapses. Disarmament. The thing about the North European plain is there are no natural frontiers that determine where France ends, Germany begins, where Germany ends, Poland begins, where Poland ends, and Russia begins. What determines the frontiers are where the armies are at the end of the last war. So, in this intensely competitive environment, and not very far away from the Bolsheviks, the Germans are forced to have a militia of only 100,000 men, which by early 20th century standards is a militia. It's not an army. No air force, no submarines, no tanks, no battleships, or except ancient ones. So, all of this is bad. And then we come to the frontier crime. Germany before World War I is this big area here in the center of Europe. And all of the orange territories are territories that Germany loses as a result of the change in frontiers at the end of the First World War. Everyone expected if Germany loses, Alsace-Lorraine is going to France. Now, Germany had actually established an independent Polish kingdom, but it was a landlocked area. The Treaty of Versailles powers decide that Poland needs a corridor to the sea. So West Prussia and Posen, parts of Silesia, become part of Poland. But that's not all, because the best port in the area is the city of Danzig, today Gdansk. Danzig is taken away from Germany and made a free city. So Poland has a chunk of what had been German territory, and one of the biggest cities in East Prussia, Danzig, is taken away from East Prussia to serve as an international port for Polish and German goods equally. Memel is taken away and given to the Lithuanians. Parts of Schleswig given to Denmark. Eupen and Malmedy given to the Belgians. The frontier crime. And the Germans rightly point out that the hypocritical allies who talk nonstop about national self-determination won't even unify Austria with the rest of Germany, despite the fact that Austria is German, culturally, linguistically, in terms of tradition. They were all part of the Holy Roman Empire together. So, all of this creates a chip on the shoulder for the Germans, the size of Texas. These are people, as a people, who are angry at the world. And the Germans have a remarkable capacity for selective memory. This is something you'll see after World War II. Instead of recalling their own treaty with the Russians at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was a victor's peace against the vanquished, the Germans forget all that. And they just see Versailles completely out of context. And they blame the Versailles powers for mutilating Germany, for amputating parts of Germany, for separating East Prussia from the rest, and so forth. So this anger is a part of what is going to blight the Weimar Republic. Weimar is a sleepy college town where the new constitution of the German, well, it's not called a Bund. Bund is the German word for republic. It's called a Reich. Reich is the German word for empire. So even though the emperor has abdicated, even though they're establishing a federal republic at Weimar, for the sake of tradition, they're going to call their republic an empire. An emperorless empire, run like a republic. Sure, fine, great. It'll please no one. The Weimar Republic is going to be ruled by the people. Except it wasn't arrived at by a process like the Frankfurt Diet back in 1848, where Germans step up and take the reins of power into their own hands. No. Freedom is imposed by the victorious Allies. Now think about this. Because the same problem exists in the South, the American South, after the American Civil War. We're a republic. We're the United States of America, where each state has to have a state constitution in harmony with the federal constitution. And yet, in the early 1870s, it's clear that the Southerners are just waiting for the Union armies to leave and be given self-government again. And the moment they are, all of the Reconstruction-era laws that bring racial equality and voting for everyone, including former slaves, and a bunch of other reforms designed to end the legacy of slavery, those are all ash-canned. And what is established is the Jim Crow system, which isn't slavery, but does establish blacks as second-class citizens. If you give self-government to people who don't believe in the basic values of the republic, what the hell are you doing? Because it's like giving a complete stranger a loaded weapon. You don't know what they're going to do. Actually, it's not like that. It's giving a career criminal who has a history of spontaneous violence your loaded weapon. Here, have it. You can trust me. See, I'm giving you my weapon. Don't be surprised when he introduces you to your own bullets. The Germans see this democracy, this Weimar Republic, not as an opportunity to rise and be free and express themselves. They see it as a sign of their humiliation. It's not their democracy. It was given to them by the victors. And the old men of Weimar, as they're called, the leaders of the Weimar Republic, are seen by many Germans as nothing less than traitors, who are there to sell Germany out. The Weimar Republic, therefore, lacks the one thing that all free societies need, which is legitimacy. Legitimacy. Does anyone remember my definition for legitimacy that I've been trying to hammer into you for 2 years now? What is legitimacy? Oh, you're going to make me sad. But sadness leads to anger. Anger leads to reprisals. Yes.
Well, for monarchs, it was the right to rule.
Yeah.
But in this,
Yep.
In this circumstance, though, legitimacy of like a country.
Yeah.
It's more or less. Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
No, it is the right to rule. You're right. And Pius, I could see the thought bubble above your head. I know you knew it. So thank you both, gentlemen. Legitimacy is the moral right to rule. The belief among the governed that it is both right and good for this person or this system to be the boss of me. That is legitimacy. In a monarchy, it's conferred by the Lord God Almighty, who makes Prince whatever come from the parents who were king and queen. In a republic, legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed as expressed through elections. So, how can you have the consent of the governed when the governed don't believe in the system? You don't. So this is a critically flawed Weimar Republic. It's like the poor Chinese women who are raised with bound feet. So you have an adult-sized woman with a little tiny girl's feet. Or those African women who are raised with lip plates. So they end up having giant lips. Or neck rings. So they end up having giraffe necks. You're blighting someone. You're basically maiming them for the sake of some cultural thing. And I assume you know about the plate-lipped African girls or the giraffe-necked African girls or the tiny little feeted Chinese girls. Don't even get me started on what they do in Somalia. Yes.
Huh?
I thought you had a hand up
Oh
earlier.
no.
Okay. So Weimar is never going to capture the loyalty or the imagination of a critical mass of the German people. They will endure it because the alternative is what? I don't know. The Allies will come back. They will endure it, but they're not loyal to it. They'll accept it passively, but don't expect us to give too much of a damn about Weimar. The Great Depression in Germany is but one of many rolling economic crises. For example, in the years immediately after World War I, the Germans are forced to pay ridiculously high reparations to France, to Britain, and others. And if Germany was even capable of paying them, it would cripple their bouncing back from the war, from converting from a war economy where they produce weapons to a peace economy where they produce consumer goods. So German economists decide we're going to inflate the currency. We'll pay you the amount. We'll pay you whatever it is. But because we've inflated the currency, and you should be knowing about inflation now because it's happening in our economy, the unit of money has less and less and less and less buying power as the market is filled with more and more units of money. It's simple law of supply and demand. If there are 100,000 pounds of gold that is the basis of the currency, and you have 100,000 marks or whatever that are going to reflect that, then the buying power of each of the 100,000 is going to be fairly great. But if you suddenly start printing paper money like it's going out of style, using the printing press, and you create 100 million paper bills that are still only representing a treasury of 100,000 pounds of gold, the buying power of each mark is going to be less and less and less. That's what's happened to the American dollar, which is the basis of the global economy, and that is what's happening. That is what happened to the Reichsmark. I will call it. It got to a point in the early 1920s, and remember, this is all to avoid paying indemnities, reparations. That janitors in factories had to go to the factory on payday with a wheelbarrow because money filled the wheelbarrow for this guy making what is today equivalent of minimum wage, so he can wheel his money home. The paper money was literally not worth the paper it was printed on. And this was all supposed to solve the reparations problem. Well, it's not going to, yes.
So we're not backed by anything, are we? Like our
Since
money?
Nixon and around 1970, no, we're not on we're not on the gold standard anymore. Since President Nixon around 1970, we float the value of the dollar on international money markets. And so the value of the dollar is whatever people are willing to pay for it. It's a stock market item, like buying stocks. So because up until now, the United States government has been among the most stable governments on earth, and a stable society, and wealthy and prosperous and powerful and all of that, most people around the world who were looking for a stable place to put their wealth would buy American dollars or buy American futures or whatever, and also would use the American dollar in some way in connection to their own money. Yeah.
Well, and didn't most of our coins, weren't they actually made of like important stuff, and now they've been kind of like...
Oh, well, before Franklin Roosevelt, we had gold and silver coins.
Right.
Franklin Roosevelt during the Depression took those out of circulation.
Well, and we had one of the coins, I don't remember. One of them was actually made of like a solid metal, and then since then it's been like...
Yeah, no, today money is purely symbolic. Yes?
I guess to respond to Haley, the penny is only about like 3% copper presidency.
Because
Now
when
not copper.
copper is much more valuable than it used to be, because we're doing a lot more with electronics. Pennies used to be made of pure copper, nickels of nickel, quarters of silver, or should I say dollars of silver, and we had gold pieces as well. Not anymore. No, it's symbolic. Uh, Here's what hyperinflation does. If you're middle class, you have savings. That's gone. Your savings account is no longer at all useful because the money doesn't count for anything like the value it did when you put the money in there. Your property, the value of your property, whether it's your home or a vehicle or something else, or a business, is now up in limbo because the value of everything is up in limbo. What inflation tends to do is take middle class people and make them poor. That's the real effect. Now, middle classes in Britain and the United States and in Germany are the natural supporters of Republican government. Because the middle class, quintessential middle class person in the cities is the small business owner, and in the countryside is the family farmer. Small business owners and family farmers want a colorblind meritocracy because they can compete. Large cartels and corporations tend to want to be in bed with the government. In any event, what hyperinflation does is it provokes the French to invade and occupy the Ruhr. The Ruhr is the industrial heartland, not of Germany, but of Europe. And the French troops occupy the Ruhr for a couple of years until they get some satisfaction from the Germans in terms of paying their indemnities. So the Germans, in effect, were willing to tank their own economy to deal with the reparations problem, and the French didn't let them. What this all leads to is poverty, insecurity, on a personal level. It's one thing to be frustrated that your country has been humiliated, that your country has been taken down a peg or three. But to yourself add to that frustration, worry about whether or not you'll be able to put food on the table this week for your children, whether you'll be able to stay with a roof over your head, where you will get your next money, where you will get your next food, where you will get your next clothes. Everything is up in the air, and people become incredibly desperate. Desperately poor, angry people do not usually make wise choices. Now, Hitler comes from Linz, Austria, lower middle class family. His father, Alois, was a minor civil servant, I believe, in their post office. His mother was doting. His father was abusive. One of Hitler's grandmothers worked as a housemaid for a Dr. Schicklgruber. And so one of the calumnies against Hitler, one of the lies told by his enemies, was that Hitler was actually the product of Herr Schicklgruber and not his legitimate family, and Schicklgruber was a Jew. So the belief was that Hitler had Jewish blood. I call it a calumny because there's no evidence to this. It's just, something you say about someone you hate. You find something ironic. And the ultimate anti-Semite having Jewish blood is ironic enough to count. His family has money problems. His father dies when he's a kid. And his mother is going to die young also. Hitler goes to, ultimately to Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Hitler wants to be an architect, but he keeps failing the architect's exam to get into universities, universities, plural, architectural programs. So Hitler ends up becoming a street artist. He'll draw pictures, he'll make pictures, sometimes he'll sell them. He lives in homeless shelters, he eats at soup kitchens. He lives like a bum. He'll take work when he can get it, but he doesn't ever hold a regular job. He continues trying to get into a program, a university, something that'll give him the ability to earn a living at this, and he continues to fail. One of the great what-ifs of history is, what if Hitler had been accepted to university and had been able to make a living as an architect? But that didn't happen. While on the streets, Hitler begins reading materials from, among other things, there's a Russian mystic from the late 1800s. I think her name is Slavatsky, but I don't remember exactly. And she had a theory about the origin of races that's semi-Darwinian and semi-completely fantasy. There's another group within Austria and Germany called the Thule Society, the Society of the Ultimate North. And they all produce little magazines that explain the reality behind the conspiracies that everyone is a part of. And the reality behind the conspiracies that everyone is a part of is that humanity is not one race, it's several races. There are the Aryans, who are the Caucasians, who stretch from Norway to Pakistan. The Indo-Europeans, the Aryans. Connected to them are the Mediterranean peoples and the Celts. Near them are the Semites, the Arabs, and the Jews. Then there are the blacks of Africa, the brown people of Asia, the yellow people of Asia, the red people of the Americas. And each of these races has a role to play in world history. But Western civilization has been infiltrated by a parasite, a racial group from the Middle East that controls ancient money, that is an international conspiracy. The Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, published a completely bogus document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this completely bogus document is evidence used by this sort of conspiracy theory that says that Judaism is a global plot to control history from behind the scenes. That the kings and prime ministers of Europe are all tools of the international Jewish conspiracy. And all of this is designed to keep the Gentiles, the non-Jews, under the control of the Jews. The Jews are like a parasite that takes over a body and controls it. They're like a demon that takes possession of someone else's land or someone else's body and runs things. This is why Hitler is unemployed. Because the people who run the artistic world in Vienna are Jews and Jew lovers and people who are Jew friends and who are owned by the Jews. So in order to explain everything that Hitler is going through, he becomes immersed in this alternate world of alternate history, alternate reality, and he's got nothing to connect him with the broader world. His family is distant and unhelpful. They don't understand him. He has occasional friends, but they are mostly in the past. None of them come with him to Vienna. He's basically alone. And what people say when they remember Hitler in his homeless shelters and soup kitchens is that sometimes he just sits and draws, and sometimes he just starts speaking. And he just rants and raves about the Jews and the conspiracies that they weave. He ultimately leaves Austria and goes to Munich, because he sees Austria as a bastard child of miscegenation. In other words, Austria is the capital of Hungarians, Slovenes, Italians, Croats, Hungarians, Poles, Czechs. and so forth. And it goes on and on. Hitler then refuses to allow himself to be drafted by the Austro-Hungarian army and begs the King of Bavaria, who's part of the German Empire, for the ability to become a Bavarian soldier instead. And it's around this time that there's a very famous picture of Hitler in the open square in the heart of Munich as part of a cheering crowd when World War I is declared. You can see Hitler's face. He's full of joy. And let me see if I can pull this up. Lights, please. Munich. Image, tools, size, large. Munich, Germany. Capital is Bavaria.
Neat.
Okay. So, here is a close-up of Hitler. And there he is in the crowd. And again, the crowd is celebrating because war has been declared. We know who the photographer was. We know when this was taken, where it was taken. It is absolutely authentic. And it is one of the first pictures of Hitler that has him leaving his private hell and entering the world of wider history. We will pick up the story of Herr Schicklgruber with his service in World War I tomorrow.
Can you say his name again?
Schicklgruber. By the way, have you ever heard this song? Okay, this is actually called the Colonel Bogey March. And the lyrics are, they're a little off color. Hitler has only just one ball. Goering has two but very small. Himmler has something similar. And as for Goebbels, there's no balls at all. So it is a very English song, and it insults literally the testicular fortitude of the German leaders in World War II. I can't believe he said it's history, folks. Lights, please. Thank you. Have a good day.